Today I want to react to the discussion between Dr. Javad Hashmi and Harris Sultan. I thought it was an interesting conversation because it wasn't simply about whether God exists. The deeper disagreement was about whether Islam itself can be reformed. Dr. Hashmi argued that Muslims do not have to choose between traditional fundamentalism and atheism. He appealed to a long history of Islamic philosophy, rationalism, and metaphorical interpretation. Harris Sultan pushed back by arguing that traditional Islam is the version that shaped history, and that modern reinterpretations are largely attempts to reconcile Islam with contemporary liberal values. As I listened, I realized my disagreement wasn't primarily with Hashmi's historical claims. My question is much more basic. What should we expect from a revelation written by the creator of the universe? If God exists and chooses to reveal a final message for all humanity, I think we should have very high expectations. I would expect that revelation to communicate its central moral teachings clearly enough that ordinary people across cultures and centuries can understand them. The Qur'an repeatedly describes itself as clear guidance revealed in clear Arabic. It does not present itself as an esoteric philosophical puzzle that only intellectual elites can decode centuries later. If that is the standard the Quran sets for itself, then clarity matters. This is where I think the Reform Project runs into a dilemma. Every time modern moral values shift, we seem to witness another round of reinterpretation. Slavery becomes historical rather than normative. Wife beating becomes symbolic. Offensive jihad becomes exclusively defensive. Punishments become contextual rather than universal. Now, maybe every one of those reinterpretations is correct, but even if they are, that raises an even bigger question. Why wasn't that the obvious understanding from the beginning? If billions of sincere Muslims, including many of Islam's greatest scholars, misunderstood God's intentions for over 1,000 years, then the communication itself appears remarkably ineffective for something supposedly authored by a perfect communicator. The other possibility is that the traditional reading was substantially correct. If that is true, then modern reformers are not recovering Islam, they are correcting it. That is why I kept thinking throughout this discussion. Imagine believing that the God who created galaxies revealed his final instructions to humanity, and then concluding that 21st century academics must rescue those instructions from what they plainly appear to say. From my perspective, that requires an extraordinary amount of confidence. Either the revelation failed to communicate clearly, or modern scholars are improving upon God's message. Neither conclusion strengthens the claim of divine revelation. I want to make an important distinction. Every text requires interpretation. Language has idioms, context, history, and ambiguity. I don't object to interpretation itself. What interests me is reinterpretation driven by changing moral intuitions. There is a difference between asking, quote, what did this verse mean in its historical context? And asking, quote, how can I make this verse compatible with modern values? When that pattern repeats over and over, it starts looking less like discovering God's intention and more like society reshaping religion. One thing Harris emphasized, and I think it deserves attention, is that traditional Islam is the Islam that actually shaped history. Empires, legal systems, classical commentaries, and mainstream scholarship overwhelmingly developed around readings that modern reformers frequently reject. Even if Dr. Hashmi can point to minority philosophical traditions, I still have to ask, if those represented God's intended understanding, why did they remain minority positions while the supposedly mistaken interpretation became dominant for so long? Ultimately, my biggest takeaway from this debate is not that Harris proved atheism or that Hashmi proved Islam can be reformed. My takeaway is that the continual need to rescue Islam from its apparent meaning raises difficult questions about revelation itself. A perfect revelation should shape humanity. Humanity should not have to shape the revelation. If 200 years from now Muslims reinterpret even more verses to match whatever society believes then, that would not increase my confidence in Islam. It would reinforce the impression that religion evolves behind culture rather than leading it. That is why I remain unconvinced. My criticism is not simply that Islam contains difficult passages. It is that the more passages require reinterpretation to remain morally acceptable, the less the book resembles the work of a perfect communicator. Thanks for watching. Let me know respectfully where you agree or disagree, and I'll see you in the next video.